In the summer of 1944, in the hedgerow country of Normandy, a German infantry squad dug into a defensive position along a sunken lane, learned something about American infantry that no amount of pre-war intelligence briefing had prepared them for. They had trained, like every German rifleman, to fight against enemies armed with bolt-action rifles, weapons that required the shooter to manually cycle the action between every shot. A mechanical pause built into the rhythm of infantry combat that German tactics had been built around for generations. German squads knew instinctively and by long habit roughly how many aimed shots an enemy rifleman could fire in a given span of time, and they planned their own movements, their own rushes across open ground around that basic and reliable arithmetic. On this particular afternoon, that arithmetic collapsed. The American riflemen across the field were not pausing to reload between shots. They were firing again and again in a steady mechanical rhythm that had no gap in it at all. And German soldiers who survived that engagement would later describe, in the language available to men trying to explain something genuinely new, the specific and disorienting experience of realizing that the enemy in front of them was simply shooting faster than the math they had trained their entire lives around allowed for. This is the story of the M1 Garand, the semi-automatic rifle that became the standard infantry weapon of the United States Army during the Second World War, and of what happened when German soldiers, trained on some of the finest bolt-action rifles ever manufactured, encountered an enemy whose basic infantry weapon quietly and permanently changed the mathematics of small unit combat. It is not a story about a single miracle weapon winning the war by itself, because no rifle does that. And any honest account of the Garand's role in the war has to resist the temptation to overstate its importance relative to artillery, air power, armor, and the sheer scale of American industrial production. But it is a story about a specific, measurable tactical advantage that American infantry carried into nearly every engagement of the war in Europe and the Pacific. An advantage that German ordnance officers understood with real clarity, and that German infantry doctrine never found an adequate answer for. To understand why the Garand mattered, you have to understand the weapon it replaced, and the weapon the German army continued to rely on for the entire war. The standard American infantry rifle before the Garand, the bolt-action Springfield, was a fine weapon by the standards of the First World War. Accurate, reliable, chambered in a powerful cartridge, and essentially identical in its basic operating principle to the German Mauser Karabiner 98K that would remain the standard German infantry rifle from the start of the war to its very end. Both rifles required the shooter to manually operate a bolt handle after every shot, ejecting the spent cartridge case and chambering a fresh round, a process that a well-trained rifleman could perform quickly, but that fundamentally limited the rate of aimed fire any single soldier could produce, no matter how skilled or well-drilled he was. This limitation was universal across almost every major army entering the war. The British Lee Enfield, the Soviet Mosin Nagant, the Japanese Arisaka, and the German Mauser were all, in this specific and fundamental sense, the same basic type of weapon, bolt-action rifles that traded rate of fire for simplicity, reliability, and low production cost. The United States Army made a decision in the years before the war that, at the time, was genuinely unusual among the major combatant nations, adopting a semi-automatic rifle as its standard infantry weapon, rather than continuing to rely on a bolt-action design. The Garand, developed by a Canadian-born engineer working for the United States government arsenal system, used gas pressure from each fired cartridge to automatically eject the spent case and chamber a new round, allowing a soldier to fire as quickly as he could pull the trigger and reacquire his sight picture, without ever needing to break his firing position to manually cycle the action. This was not a minor incremental improvement over a bolt-action rifle. It represented a fundamental shift in what a single infantryman was capable of contributing to a firefight, and by the time American forces entered combat in North Africa and then in the European and Pacific theaters, every American infantry division was built around the assumption that its riflemen could sustain a rate of aimed fire that no bolt-action army in the world could match on a rifleman-by-rifleman basis. German ordnance officers were aware of the Garand's existence well before large numbers of American troops actually arrived in combat, through pre-war intelligence reporting and through captured examples obtained in the early North African fighting, but awareness on paper and the actual battlefield experience of facing the weapon turned out to be two very different things. Early encounters with American infantry in Tunisia produced a string of German after-action reports describing what officers initially assumed must be unusually intense or unusually well-coordinated American fire, small unit engagements in which German attackers found themselves suppressed or pinned by what felt like automatic weapons fire coming from ordinary American riflemen rather than from machine gun positions. It took a period of confused battlefield reporting, cross-referenced eventually with captured weapons and prisoner interrogations, before German intelligence fully confirmed what was actually happening. That standard American infantrymen, not just designated automatic riflemen or machine gunners, were individually capable of a volume of aimed fire that German tactical doctrine had simply never had to account for from an opposing rifleman. A German infantry officer who fought in Tunisia and later in Italy, in an account preserved in a post-war collection of German veteran interviews focused on infantry, small arms, and tactics, described the specific tactical problem this created for his unit. He said that standard German infantry assault tactics relied heavily on short-timed rushes across open ground between covered positions, a technique explicitly built around the predictable pause created by a bolt-action rifle's reload cycle, with squads coordinating their movement so that at any given moment, most of the defending riflemen opposite them would be in the brief window of cycling their bolts rather than actively aiming and firing. He said that against American positions equipped with the Garand, this entire tactical framework broke down because the assumed gap in defensive fire during a bolt cycle simply did not exist in the same way. And German squads making these traditional short rushes found themselves exposed to sustained fire for a much larger percentage of their movement than the tactic had been designed to survive. He described having to substantially revise his unit's approach to assaulting defended American positions, relying more heavily on covering fire from machine guns and mortars to suppress American riflemen specifically, because the traditional assumption that a defending rifleman needed a pause to reload no longer reliably applied. The volume of fire the Garand allowed a single rifleman to produce also had a documented psychological effect on German troops that went beyond the purely tactical mathematics of rushes and cover, an effect that multiple post-war accounts from German veterans describe in strikingly similar terms. Bolt-action combat, for all its lethality, had a rhythm to it that German soldiers understood intuitively from years of training and combat experience, individual distinguishable shots spaced out by the mechanical action of the bolt. A rhythm that gave an experienced soldier a rough sense of how many riflemen were actually firing at him and how much danger he was actually in at any given moment. Garand fire disrupted that intuitive reading of a battlefield, A small number of American riflemen firing Garands could produce a volume and tempo of rifle fire that, to German ears trained on the sound of bolt-action combat, suggested a much larger defending force than was actually present, an auditory and psychological illusion that several German veteran accounts specifically describe as disorienting in the moment and difficult to correct. For even once a soldier intellectually understood what kind of weapon he was facing. There is a specific and often repeated detail in the history of the Garand that deserves careful and accurate treatment because it has become somewhat exaggerated and mythologized in popular retellings over the decades. The Garand's en-bloc clip, the metal container that held 8 rounds of ammunition and was inserted as a single unit into the rifle, produced a distinctive metallic ping sound when it was ejected automatically after the 8th and final round was fired, a sound that has become one of the most discussed details in the entire history of the weapon. A persistent piece of battlefield folklore repeated in numerous post-war accounts and popular histories holds that German soldiers learned to listen for this ping as a signal that an American rifleman's weapon was now empty and would use that moment to expose themselves or launch an assault, a tactic sometimes described as countered by American soldiers who would deliberately carry a spare clip and let it fall to produce a false ping, luring German soldiers into believing the rifle was empty when it was not. Military historians who have studied this claim closely have found remarkably little solid documentary evidence that this specific tactical countermeasure was actually a widespread, deliberate American practice. And the broader claim that German soldiers systematically and reliably use the ping as a battlefield cue is difficult to verify with confidence, given how chaotic and loud actual combat conditions typically were. Conditions in which a single metallic ping from one rifle among dozens or hundreds of weapons firing simultaneously would often have been effectively inaudible. What can be documented with more confidence is that the ping was a real and audible feature of the weapon under quieter conditions, and that it became, over the decades since the war, one of the most enduring pieces of Garand folklore. Whatever the actual tactical significance of the sound turned out to be under real combat conditions. What is far better documented and far more tactically significant than the ping story is the simple, repeated, and consistent pattern found across German after-action reports and veteran interviews describing the sheer volume of sustained rifle fire American infantry units could produce compared to German or other bolt-action armed forces. This pattern shows up not as a single dramatic anecdote, but as a recurring theme across a wide range of engagements in theaters, from the deserts of North Africa through the hedgerows of Normandy and into the forests of the Ardennes during the final German offensive of the war. German infantry commanders repeatedly noted in operational reports that American infantry positions, even when defended by relatively small numbers of riflemen, produced a volume of small arms fire that made accurate assessment of defending strength difficult, and that assaulting such positions using standard German infantry tactics tended to produce higher than expected casualties among the attacking force, specifically in the opening phase of an assault, the phase during which attacking infantry were most exposed, and during which the defender's rate of fire mattered most. General George Patton, whose own documented enthusiasm for the weapon is a matter of clear historical record rather than folklore, famously described the Garand as the greatest battle implement ever devised, a statement that reflected not simply personal enthusiasm, but a broader and genuinely held view within American senior military leadership that the decision to field a semi-automatic rifle as the standard infantry weapon had provided American ground forces with a meaningful and measurable tactical edge over armies still relying on bolt-action designs. This view was not universally uncontested even within American military circles, since some officers and post-war analysts pointed out correctly that rifle fire itself accounted for a relatively small percentage of overall combat casualties compared to artillery, mortars, and machine gun fire across the war as a whole, and that the Garand's advantages, while real, existed within a broader combined arms system where no single weapon determined outcomes in isolation. Both of these things can be true simultaneously: that the Garand was not by itself a war-winning weapon, and that it provided American infantry with a specific, well-documented, and tactically meaningful advantage in the particular kind of close-range, small-unit engagements that made up an enormous amount of actual ground combat throughout the war. The German Army's own response to the Garand's demonstrated advantages tells its own story about the pressures the weapon created within German ordnance planning. German engineers had, in fact, experimented with semi-automatic and select-fire rifle designs before and during the war, and Germany eventually did field its own semi-automatic and later select-fire infantry rifles in limited numbers during the final years of the conflict. Weapons that represented a genuine attempt to close the tactical gap that American, and to a lesser extent, given more limited semi-automatic issue, other Allied forces had opened with widespread adoption of self-loading rifles. These German programs, however, arrived too late and in numbers too small to meaningfully change the overall infantry small arms balance of the war, hampered by the same broader collapse in German industrial capacity and raw material availability that constrained nearly every advanced German weapons program in the final years of the conflict. The overwhelming majority of German infantrymen fought the entire war, from the first day to the last, with the same basic bolt-action Mauser design that had armed German infantry since well before the war began, a fact that meant the tactical mismatch created by widespread American Garand issue was never meaningfully corrected at scale, and remained a consistent feature of infantry combat between American and German forces across every theater and every year of the war in which the two armies met. There is a broader lesson embedded in the story of the Garand that extends beyond the specific mechanics of rifle design, and it has to do with how a single, carefully considered procurement decision made years before a war actually began can shape the tactical experience of that war at the most basic individual level, the level of one rifleman facing another across a stretch of open ground. The decision to adopt the Garand was made in the 1930s, in peacetime, by American military planners and ordnance officials who had to weigh the real costs and genuine risks of fielding a mechanically more complex weapon against the potential tactical advantages such a weapon might provide in a future conflict that, at the time the decision was made, had not yet begun, and whose eventual shape no one could fully predict. That decision, made years in advance and refined through a sometimes difficult development and production process, meant that by the time American infantry actually met German infantry in combat, the basic rifleman on the American side was carrying a weapon that fundamentally outperformed, in the specific dimension of sustained rate of aimed fire, the weapon carried by his German counterpart. A gap that German infantry doctrine, German tactical training, and German wartime industrial capacity were never able to fully close, and that shaped, in ways both large and small, in ways documented in after-action reports and veteran memories from Tunisia, to the final collapse of Germany in 1945. The basic and often lethal mathematics of infantry combat between the two armies for the entire duration of the war. The adoption process itself was neither smooth nor uncontested, and it is worth understanding the institutional resistance the Garand had to overcome before it ever reached a single soldier's hands, because that resistance illustrates just how unusual the American decision actually was at the time. Many senior officers within the Army's own ordnance and training establishments in the years leading up to adoption expressed real skepticism about replacing the proven, simple, and inexpensive bolt-action rifle with a more mechanically complex self-loading design. Concerns raised during the development period included worries about reliability in the mud, dust, and general abuse of actual field conditions. Worries about the higher unit cost and slower production rate of a more complex weapon compared to a simple bolt-action rifle, and a more general institutional conservatism common to militaries evaluating any significant break from a proven weapon type. These concerns were not irrational, and early production and testing of the Garand did in fact surface genuine reliability issues that had to be worked through during a lengthy development and refinement process spanning much of the 1930s. The rifle that finally reached mass production and widespread issue by the time of American entry into the war in December 1941 was the product of this extended, sometimes contentious development process. A weapon whose early problems had been substantially resolved through years of testing and design revision before it ever had to prove itself under actual combat conditions. It is also worth noting that not every American soldier who carried a Garand into combat found the weapon perfect, and honest accounts from American veterans alongside the German testimony discussed earlier help round out a fuller picture of the rifle's actual battlefield reputation. American infantrymen occasionally noted the weight of the loaded rifle, heavier than the bolt-action rifles it replaced, a real consideration for men who had to carry the weapon along with the rest of their combat load across long marches and difficult terrain. Some veterans also noted that the fixed 8-round capacity and the need to reload the entire clip at once, rather than topping off a partially fired magazine as could be done with some other rifle designs, created its own occasional tactical inconvenience. Moments where a rifleman with a partially fired clip had to choose between firing off the remaining rounds to clear the weapon for a fresh clip or holding a partially loaded rifle in a situation that called for a full 8 rounds ready to fire. These were genuine, documented limitations rather than mere folklore, and a fully honest account of the Garand's combat record has to include them alongside its clear and well-documented tactical advantages. Because the actual historical record of any widely issued combat weapon is rarely as simple as the popular celebratory version of its story tends to suggest. None of these limitations, however, meaningfully undermine the fundamental and repeatedly documented tactical reality that German infantry encountered across every theater of the war in which they faced American ground forces. That a standard American rifle squad, man for man, was capable of producing a sustained volume of aimed rifle fire that no German infantry unit equipped with standard-issue Mauser rifles could match using conventional bolt-action weapons alone. This gap shaped German tactical planning at the unit level throughout the war, contributed to a documented and repeated pattern of higher-than-anticipated German casualties during the exposed opening phases of infantry assaults against American positions, and left a clear and lasting impression on the German soldiers who survived those engagements, and later described, in post-war interviews and memoirs, the specific and disorienting experience of facing an enemy rifleman who, For the first time in the history of that particular mechanical arms race, simply did not need to stop and reload as often as the tactics they had trained on for years had always assumed he would.